Why do you start a movie about an artist who gave his first interview at the age of 5, had a first solo show at the age of 10, and took part in Documenta in Kassel at the age of 23? Like this? Or like this? Like that? Or maybe like this? Well, let's start at the beginning. Braco Dimitrijevic was born in Sarajevo, into the family of the well-known painter O.Gehry Dimitrijevic. Dimitrijević's childhood was marked by the complex political and cultural circumstances of post-war Yugoslavia, as much as by his family environment. His father's studio was a meeting place, where he came into contact with a wide range of personalities, ranging from Ivo Andrić, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, to Jean-Paul Sartre. It's possible that Braco's critical attitude towards authority, personal myths and public images was formed at this early age.
From the window in the house I was born, I used to see on my right the synagogue, few mosques, old Orthodox church, the oldest mosque, the base mosque, the big cathedral, and all the other monuments. And if you were learned to respect all that, from the start you were a global citizen. From historic point of view, this is the most important spot in Sarajevo because here was assassinated Archduke Ferdinand. In this house, Archduke Ferdinand spent last night of his life. But in my personal history, or shall I say rather in post-history, this place have a certain significance. In 1954, I met President Tito here, and he was probably my first casual passerby.
From a very young age, Braco Dimitrijevic showed a talent for painting. A family anecdote says that long before he could read, he was able to distinguish the monograph on Matisse from the one on Cézanne. Considered a child prodigy, Dimitrijevic gave his first newspaper interview at the age of 5. And he had his first one-man show of 50 oil paintings at the age of 10. A 30-minute documentary about the little painter was made and shown in cinemas around the country before the main feature. We met him on the streets of Sarajevo. He was looking for inspiration for his new painting. His name is Braco Dimitrijevic. He learned about a palette, brushes and painter's canvas before he knew about school books. In the studio, he is often visited by school friends. He is 8 years old and is a third-year pupil in primary school. When he is not at school, he spends most of his time painting, and he likes showing his work to his friends. This painting he named Boy and Horse. Gladiolus is one of his favorite paintings. Judging by his most recent painting, it looks like this young artist is heading towards abstraction. In his teenage years, Dimitrijevic gave up painting and got professionally involved in skiing. He became a member of the national team and, as a junior champion, often traveled for international competitions. The artist compares making art to skiing downhill at 100 kilometers per hour. Both require courage and quick decision-making, as well as the absolute mastery of space and time.
After the first solo show that I had at the age of 10, I completely lost interest in art, and I thought I would never become an artist. The true emancipation as an individual I achieved by winning some skiing competitions on these Olympic mountains, which are right behind me.
Although I've been living with Braco for a great many years, he always manages to surprise me with something. When I first saw him, he was doing a downhill competition. When he reached the Ziel, he took off the helmet and there was this long hair coming down to the shoulders, which was quite surprising to see a sportsman with long hair. And we actually met like the day after in a club, and ever since we've been together.
After a happy childhood, which paradoxically produced a doubting and questioning intellect, Dimitrijevic decided to leave Sarajevo in search of his own identity. After 2 years trying to forget his artistic vocation, studying physics and mathematics, he went to London and Paris for several months in the autumn of 1967 and the spring of 1968. His frequent visits to the Tate and National Galleries in London made him decide to study art.
So it was in the fall of the 1967 that I landed here in London, which for our generation was the center of the universe. We were obviously in the middle of the swinging 60s, and I used to come almost every day to National Gallery or the Tate Gallery. And it was here in the National Gallery, in the front of one of the Paolo Uccello's painting, that I realized that my working methods were more artistic ones.
In 1968, as a student of the Zagreb Academy of Fine Art, Dimitrijevic began his interventions in the urban environment, involving the participation of people on the street. As a rebellious young artist, he chose public space as an alternative to the gallery. Dimitrijevic installed a heap of plaster on the road, waiting with a camera. When a car passed by, the cloud produced was photographed and entitled "Accidental Sculpture." The artist insisted that, despite its short life of a few seconds, this work had all the traits of sculpture. It was made from plaster and it had a volume. Painting by Krešimir Klika is a key work from this period. Dimitrijevic installed a milk carton on the street, waiting for a car to run it over. He stopped the driver and asked him what he thought of the milk splash. If the driver judged the splash to be art, he was asked to sign it. This work implies a fundamental change in the notions of authenticity and authorship. When the driver agreed to sign the milk splash, authorship shifted from Dimitrijevic, who set up the situation, to the driver, who accomplished the action. Simultaneously to Roland Barthes' essay on the death of the author, we witness the birth of Krešimir Klika, the artist and the spectator in one. In 1969, Dimitrijevic wrote, "The artist only arranges the initial situation, the development of which depends on chance, understanding, and the approval of the other persons. When entering a gallery, a visitor is prepared to see works of art. I have tried to choose people at random, without knowing whether they have a feeling for art. They've been included in the act of creating, and the dividing line that existed between artist and non-artist has been removed." From very early on, Braco Dimitrijevic started reflecting on the relativity of history and criteria in art, and also on fame and anonymity.
Friend of my father, a quite well-known writer, Ivo Andrić, who received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1963. When you are quite little, you don't imagine kind of a Nobel Prize winner being a very shy person. And I was enjoying much more the stories of the guardian of our school. In a way, all these invented stories of the school guardian were somehow more funny, and I was thinking at a certain point that he was the one who deserved the Nobel Prize.
In 1969, Braco Dimitrijevic wrote A Story About Two Painters.
Once upon a time, far from cities and towns, there lived two painters. One day, the king, hunting nearby, lost his dog. He found him in the garden of one of the two painters. He saw the works of that painter and took him to the castle. The name of that painter was Leonardo da Vinci. The name of the other disappeared forever from human memory.
Dimitrijević's story was quoted years later in a Warner Brothers production of Great Expectations, starring Gwyneth Paltrow and Robert De Niro. The director, Alfonso Cuarón, used Dimitrijević's fiction about two artists to emphasize the main character's aspiration to fame.
This story is a fiction. It has nothing to do with the real facts of Leonardo's life, but it is a metaphor for this mutilated image of the past where one figure is missing, and we can find dozens of examples from general history and art history. For instance, if we think that Kafka didn't publish anything for first 30 years after he died, that we didn't know 100 years about Tesla, that we ignored El Greco for 3 centuries, I'm asking myself whose 3 centuries are running now.
In the late 60s, in contrast to land and earth artists, Dimitrijevic chose the city as the place of his interventions. Unlike the natural landscape, the city is loaded with historical meanings which reflect the myths of ideology. Monuments of different kinds are not only the aesthetic vocabulary of the city, they are also signs of the dominant ideology, charged with its connotations and values. Confronted in childhood with the personality cult, Dimitrijevic chose to intervene in places reserved for the display of authoritarian symbols. In a totalitarian society, the rhetoric of power in the city is amplified. Military parades mark important dates. Flags, banners, and gigantic portraits are hung up during the state holidays. In May 1971, Dimitrijevic installed on the main square of Zagreb the portraits of unknown people, whom he would select randomly on the street. Before dawn, 3 portraits appeared on a facade of Republic Square.
These photographs were installed about 2 a.m. and people going to work at 6 o'clock and waiting for tramways, when seeing these 3 large portraits, they thought it was a coup d'etat, because before that they were used to photograph of President Tito and other politicians, which were hanging exactly on the same spot.
In the spirit of his street works, Dimitrijevic found an alternative exhibition space. The space, named Frankopanska 2A, housed several one-day exhibitions. In this space, in 1971, Braco and his wife, art critic Nena Dimitrijevic, organized an international exhibition of conceptual art. The exhibition, entitled At the Moment, was one of the first shows of the emerging art movement and included the following artists: Giovanni Anselmo, Robert Barry, Joseph Beuys, Daniel Buren, Jan Dibbets, Braco Dimitrijevic, Barry Flanagan, Douglas Hubler, Jannis Kounellis, Sol Lovit, Lawrence Wiener, and Ian Wilson, among others. Frankopanska 2A preceded by several years the appearance of alternative art spaces elsewhere, as well as the later curatorial fashion for organizing exhibitions in non-art sites. In September 1971, Dimitrijevic participated in the prestigious Paris Biennale. He exhibited a large portrait of a casual passerby on Boulevard Saint-Germain, one of the busiest spots of the capital, frequented daily by some 2 million people. After being seen by a great number of Parisians and tourists, 2 weeks later, the photo was removed by the police and the fire brigade. Echoes of May '68, still very much alive in the occasional street confrontations with students, made the police sensitive to the work. The only explanation given to the artist was a laconic, "The photograph disturbs Paris."
Dans les années 70, on a pu voir au Boulevard Saint-Germain.
It was an extraordinary experience to see an enormous portrait of an unknown person on Boulevard Saint-Germain. Today, it may seem less surprising, because now the art world is familiar with the work of Brazzo. But then, it was an extraordinary experience. In those difficult years after '68, all young people were under surveillance. It was an act of extraordinary freedom. I didn't forget that work, and a few years later, when I was working at the Pompidou Center, I had an opportunity to buy it for the collection. It was one of the major events of that year's Biennale. You would not usually expect to see this kind of large portrait looking like a representation of a politician under certain regimes. After seeing his work in Paris, the Italian art dealer, Lucio Emilio, invited the young artist to do an exhibition in his gallery in Naples. Emilio arranged Dimitrijević's opening on the same day as Joseph Beuys's first solo show in Italy, which took place on the other floor of the same gallery. It was the beginning of a friendship between the older artist and the 23-year-old Dimitrijević, which lasted until Beuys's death in 1986. The opening of the two exhibitions was an occasion for Dimitrijević to make a piece questioning the group photo as historic document. He stopped a casual passerby, a customs officer, and asked him to join the group, which included Beuys, Germana Celant, Kounellis, Achille Bonito Oliva, Mario, and Marisa Mertz. A few seconds later, the camera recorded the scene for posterity, together with the Italian customs agent Francesco Abatiello. In the Casual Passerby series, the work is situated in a public space without explanation, while the gallery distributes supplementary information. The artist opposes a random meeting, chance, to the determinism of history. He hopes to change our uncritical acceptance of the city's persuasive language and the unquestioning attitude towards the mass media and history.
I had an exhibition with René Bloch and the big portrait of the woman passerby on Steinplatz. And I remember one day Samuel Beckett came and then he said, "What time did you meet this woman?" And I said, like 2:14 p.m. And then he said in his very Beckettian way, "You could have waited for 2 more minutes."
In the autumn of 1971, Dimitrijević left for London to continue his studies at St. Martin's School of Art. At the time, the school's reputation was based on the success of the new generation sculptors.
This is the 3D space, or as we used to call it, a sculpture studio. And there were ongoing discussions with our dear Professor Anthony Caro. And I remember I made my first monument to casual passerby here in this studio.
There was this sense of swinging London. But at the same time, you had this very severe school of abstract sculpture. Suddenly, in the body of this school, St. Martin's, there emerged really a surprising number of rather subversive figures. I mean, on the one hand, Barry Flanagan making soft sculpture, on the other, Gilbert and George, or Bruce McLean working in close proximity.
In the studio at St. Martin's, Dimitrijevic spent several weeks modelling a realistic, larger-than-life-size portrait head. No one realised that he was working for his exhibition with the Situation Gallery, and that the portrait was the head of David Harper, the casual passerby whom he had met at 1:10 p.m. on the street. In April 1972, the monument to David Harper was installed in Berkeley Square. Richard Cork of the Evening Standard supported the project by informing the paper's 7 million readers that the monument in Berkeley Square was erected in honour of their fellow citizen, David Harper.
And I very well remember in the early 70s, suddenly this artist appeared. First I saw the work in catalogues and books, and then eventually Robert Self of the Situation Gallery decided to invite this artist, Braco Dimitrijevic, to make a project in London. And he made this project, which of course we all now know, with a casual passerby. And what really interested me about this was the fact that here was an artist who was coming from Central Europe, who had a different culture, but was very much engaged with some of the concerns of artists who were already quite well known on the scene and working in the field of conceptual art. But he had a very particular point of view, and this was, I think, distinctive in that he was thinking always about history. He was thinking about the place of the individual in history. And, of course, the casual passerby was this person who was taken from absolute obscurity, and yet one was realized that history picks up people almost by accident and then presents them in this very public way. And Braco somehow made us all very conscious of this. And of course, then he was spending more time in London and beginning, in a way, to become part of the London scene. And he was, in a way, a kind of cosmopolitan figure, but also a figure who brought a very special sensibility to the London scene.
The Situation Gallery also obtained permission from London Transport to have the posters of a casual passerby displayed on bus route number 14. The serious face could easily have been mistaken for a new party candidate. But in fact, it was a man who happened to be walking down Charing Cross Road at 11:28 a.m. The bus project was revived in summer 2005 in connection with Open Systems, an exhibition of early conceptualism at Tate Modern.
Braco is someone I've known for many years, meeting up with him in New York or, yeah, indeed, Sydney, Australia, or Paris, where we are right here, sitting in his apartment. And I met up with him in this strange world called art, whatever that is. The most important thing, I suppose, for Braco and for all of us that were brought up and educated on the streets in the 60s was we hated the thought that the world was going to be commodified. And we took up bows and arrows and used to think that we could stop this huge, giant juggernaut coming down the motorway telling us that our world was seriously at a loss, was going to fast disappear. And we took up arms, our voices, our poetry, our ideas. We tried to relate it all to the ruins of the 50s, all that rock and roll outlawed spirit and all the creatures that stood out, you know. A punk for us was somebody who took it up the ass, as William Burroughs said. We thought that we were the one chance to change the planet and change its culture from heading into this commodified abyss.
When I moved to London and when I was working at St. Martin's, I realized that history in London landscape has been inscribed in a completely different way than in the country where I was coming from. So I realized that there were just monuments, no big photographs, that there were all these memorial plaques.
The artist produced memorial plaques with the names of people living in the neighborhood. He installed the plaques with the inscription, "John Foster lived here," or "Sarah Knight stayed here," on the respective buildings in Soho.
For instance, if you would see a memorial plaque on the building, message would be, "The genius lived here." Every building with no memorial plaque explicitly would mean a genius never lived here. So I really wanted to be sure about this issue because we know how many times history was wrong and how many times the centuries later passed for this to be corrected.
In the spring of 1972, Dimitrijevic prepared an exhibition at Gallery Konrad Fischer in Düsseldorf. Since neither the gallery nor the artist had the means to pay for the production of the large photograph, Josef Beuys generously offered to do so. Beuys offered Dimitrijevic his studio for the preparation and introduced him to his former students Blinky Palermo and Emi Knubel, who proved extremely helpful in taking photographs and helping with production. This work was also exhibited in Documenta 5 in Kassel. In Harald Siemens' Documenta, the anthological exhibition of conceptual art, land art and arte povera, the 23-year-old Dimitrijevic, at the time still a student at St. Martin's, was one of the youngest participants. In the early 70s, during his solo exhibitions, Dimitrijevic would often replace his name on a banner with those of passers-by. During his solo show at the Städtisches Museum Mönchengladbach, the name of Erich Hofer was displayed on the facade. And for his show at the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, that of Gerda Bollin, a passerby. Another form of official recognition and social behavior that Dimitrijevic parodied were the cocktail parties and dinners given for VIPs. The artist organized such events in honor of casual passers-by.
That was always the most fascinating thing to me, was the casual passerby. But my favorite, I like the photographs, but tell me about the thing I was interested in was the events, the
cocktail
parties,
official dinners,
the banquets.
That's right, yeah. And the very first one I've done on the occasion for festival in Belgrade in '74. We just printed unofficial invitations.
How did you come to do this banquet for Mr. Sinovic? Was it just random?
Yeah, I met him whenever I decide to do the piece, I just walk on the street and if I step outside of your house and if we are doing a passerby piece, it would be the first person who accepts to be photographed.
It's totally random.
Totally random. I mean, it is less random if he refuses, and then I wait for the next one.
After Documenta 5, Dimitrijevic exhibited at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Zagreb. It was the first museum show given to a conceptual artist in this part of Europe. Together with works from the Casual Passerby series, he showed a group of his drip paintings in the style of Jackson Pollock. Reflecting Dimitrievic's theory of non-originality, the paintings, made in 1972, anticipated the appropriationist tendency by a whole decade.
I remember the idea of kind of democratization of art would go even that far that for my first ever museum, a solo show in Zagreb Museum of Contemporary Art, the day after the opening, I would go on the street and give to passers-by some 50 drawings just for free, and saying that the frontier between the street and the museum should not exist.
We decided to be authentic, to be true, was to actually be anti-art, anti-fashion, anti-music, anti-a culture basically that we didn't really recognize or covet as something that was going to express our desires at the time. And sadly, we were all defeated. And by the dawn of the 70s, we went through immense anger. And some of us descended onto the street and tried to relate to the new generation. Not particularly interested in being an artist per se, but being a warrior, being someone who was a guerrilla, being someone who was a revolutionary, being someone who was going to change life itself.
In the summer of 1976, Braco Dimitrijevic participated in the Venice Biennale. A large portrait of a passerby was shown on the Grand Canal, which aroused considerable interest. Numerous phone calls were made to the Biennale offices by tourists wanting to know the identity of the person in the photograph. In the same Biennale, the artist exhibited inside the work entitled Dialectic Chapel. Bronze busts, that of the famous artist and that of a casual passerby, were raised up on equal pedestals. The anonymity of Angelko Hundic was the antithesis to the importance attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. At the height of conceptual art and the dominating aesthetic of photography, the work, made in the traditional materials of marble and bronze, seemed totally heretical. The work, Dialectic Chapel, was later enlarged to the whole gallery of famous artists. Leonardo, Dürer, Rembrandt and Turner were accompanied by their anonymous counterparts. New York critic Clara Weiergraff wrote that today, the king from Dimitrijevich's story takes the form of the art market, curators, granting institutions, museums and collectors. Dimitrijevic met his first New York passers-by in 1975 and showed these works at the Sperone Gallery in Soho. In those days, long before the inkjet procedure was invented, producing a photograph of this size was not only an artistic, but also a technical challenge. In the early years, Dimitrijevic used photographic paper and glued the fragments onto a large canvas. To sew a canvas strong enough to resist windy weather, the artist had to use all his experience of repairing the sails on his boat.
I was impressed with the passerby photographs because I think that they disarm one, because it's very few times where an enormous photograph is given to every man. And when you see the fact that it's every man and any man, you have an immediate identification with it because it cuts across commercials, it cuts across politics, and it cuts across every class. And it reminded me, I think, at first blush of something Jannis said. Jannis was sitting on a train toward the end of his life. I don't know if you know the story or not. And he was looking at the guy across from him, and then he had one of this almost like acid transferences where he saw himself as the man looking at himself. Right. So he saw himself as every man. And the fact that you take the common man and give the common man the recognition of what would often be the hero, the political star, the rising star, the advertising Hollywood star, the fact that it's reduced to everyone allows all of us to participate in the physiognomy of something that we recognize daily that's never given credit. Because the real heroes of the society, as we all know, are the people who are never recognized and never claimed. And I think it had a lot to do with the art de pauvre movement at the time. It had a lot to do with the conceptual movement at the time. It had a lot to do with reducing everything to ground zero and starting all over.
In 1976, Braco Dimitrijevic published a book entitled Tractatus Post Historicus, providing a theoretical foundation for his art. It opposes his photographs and monuments to passers-by to those similar forms found in the city. Tractatus Post Historicus foreshadowed a number of ideas relating to history, progress, originality, and style that have become dominant within postmodernism and neo-conceptual art. Tractatus Post Historicus is a critique of history and the way in which historical and cultural meanings and values are constructed. It was published 4 years before Charles Jenks coined the term postmodernism, and long before Arthur Danto started referring to the end of history.
In my book, I'm suggesting multi-angular viewing of events and plurality of truth, coexistence of different values, different interpretations, and different models and different concepts.
Brazzo has always had this very profound sense of history. And I think what was remarkable about what he did in the late 70s and into the early 80s was the way in which he alerted us to changes that were taking place in thinking more broadly. I mean, essentially, he anticipated in many ways the kind of what we now see as a postmodern way of thinking about the work of art and about the context in which a work is shown and how meaning is highly dependent on context and period in history. And he, by the works, however, that he made, I think one of the key things he did was to break this sense of a continuous narrative. I mean, he brought the present in immediate conjunction and juxtaposition with historical figures and historical fact.
Coming from a city charged with strong historical connotations, Dimitrijevic developed skepticism about the credibility of history and towards any one-sided truth.
Here in Greek Street is the first location of my portable monument. This could be a place of historical importance.
In Documenta 6 in 1977, Dimitrijevic exhibited a 17-metre-long frieze of photographs, each bearing the inscription, "This could be a place of historical interest." Anonymous locations, varying from a romantic corner of the countryside to a monumental staircase or official building, became subject to the suggestive power of this conditional sentence. A stone plaque with the same inscription was built into the pavement in front of Cologne Cathedral in 1980. This discreet monument is walked past by thousands of pedestrians every day, and only a few wonder about its meaning. During his stay in Berlin as a guest of the DAAD program in 1976, Dimitrijevic had a project for a monumental public work.
I came to an idea to erect an obelisk that would celebrate randomly selected day.
The location he chose was the domain of Schloss Charlottenburg, the Prussian Versailles. He met with the director of Charlottenburg Castle to explain his project, knowing that there was very little chance of its realization. Back in London, he received a telegram with a short message. Obelisk is okay.
I stopped the passerby on the streets in Berlin, and I remember it was a gentleman with the name of Peter Malwitz, and he said, "Well, is it okay 11th of March?" And I said, "Yes, please tell me what it is." And he said, "It is my birthday."
Peter Malwitz's birthday was engraved in big letters in the marble, and underneath it the sentence, "This could be a day of historical importance," was added in 4 languages. The obelisk stands at the end of a historical axis, framed by Prussian memorials, busts of Roman emperors, and royal graves, between the signs of power and aesthetic concerns for the landscape. It's become a legitimate city monument, and it's even included in tourist brochures. This is the most monumental piece of conceptual art ever made, a homage to chance and the history of every individual.
I mean, I love what you did with Casual Passerby. But there's all this humor there, too. There's something very whimsical and kind of amusing about all of it. That's what I like. There's playfulness to it, you know. You told me this story about when you had this man's face plastered on the side of the Pompidou Museum. And, you know, I guess it was for how long was he there?
For 3 months.
And every day he brought a different woman.
That's right, yeah. He was in different, with different girlfriends or friends, but with different women he would come and sit and show it to them.
One of the guys, didn't he want to use the photo, I guess it was on canvas. You wanted to use it as a sail for a sailboat?
That's right, the Dutch guy, yeah, which I showed at the Eindhoven Museum. I explained to him that this canvas was not so strong as a kind of real sail.
He might have been lost from all human memory as
That's
well.
right. Another passerby I met was the guy who, when I stopped him on Boulevard Bon Marché in Paris, and he was a young guy, 20 years old, and he said, look, I was explaining that I have this book and that I'm photographing casual passers-by. And then he said, look, this is pretty unoriginal and it's very stupid what you do because Dimitrijevic has done it 20 years ago. And he thought I was somebody much older. And he left me in the middle of the street. I always think of every person that he is a genius until he proves differently.
Je pense que je dois rencontrer ton travail avant de te rencontrer. Je me souviens plus bien. Merci. Les premières choses que
Quelle est la première pièce que tu as vue?
je pense même que ça peut être une... Enfin, je ne sais pas si une influence, mais j'ai reconnu quelque chose, c'était une chose autour des aluminium.
I don't know when I met you. I think I knew your work before I met you. I don't remember very well. I even think it maybe had, I don't know if it was an influence, but I recognized something in it, especially about the idea of the anonymous. I believe I first saw your work in books and big portraits on walls. I was very impressed by it, and even more by the posters in the city, by the monuments.
Je vais dire une chose qui va te mécontenter beaucoup. Je pense que c'est un travail chrétien. Et tu es tellement chrétien, n'est-ce pas?
What I like about this work is that anyone can be chosen. Anyone can be a saint. The Christians have this holiday of All Saints' Day as one possible reading. I'm not saying it's yours, that everybody is a saint. Everyone is unique and important. History with a capital H preserves portraits of presidents, of scientists, but it could preserve the portraits of all people.
Et que finalement, la grande histoire garde les portraits des présidents, des savants, mais qui pourrait garder le portrait de tout le monde.
For the opening of a new museum in Hereford, Dimitrijevic was asked to create a special work.
What do you think of the casual passerby photograph on the facade of your museum?
Oh, I said it was not only good, it was perfect.
Cheers.
All right.
We're based at the University of Pennsylvania, and most of our exhibitions take the form of collaborations with artists primarily coming of age in the 60s and 70s, such as Braco Dimitrijevic, Dennis Oppenheim, Herman Nietzsche, Günter Bruce, and many other artists of that period. For this particular project with Braco, we've done a few things. One, we've organized a series of outdoor casual passerby projects with the artist. These, for us, take the form of an analysis of the ways that the public sphere has changed in America over the last few years. As opposed to the ways that Braco's work may have been read in the 60s, 70s, the work today calls attention to a culture of advertising and of the image.
È la fortuna di essere qua e poi che è evidente che il lavoro mi
I'm very happy to be here. I like Braco's work very much. We have known each other for many years, as you can see from that photograph in the exhibition.
Anche nelle facce quanti anni ci conosciamo, non c'è bisogno di
We met on various occasions and always talked about our roles and our particularities as artists. Also today, we had a good discussion. Artists always have to think and speak about the future. The past was marvelous, but the future will be glorious.
Anche oggi bisogna parlare del futuro. Il passato è stato bellissimo, no? Il futuro sarà glorioso.
Another city where Braco Dimitrijevic grew up is the Renaissance city of Dubrovnik, the old Republic of Ragusa.
This is my second hometown, Dubrovnik, also the place full of history with this beautiful architecture. And this is a place where I made my first conceptual artworks, and I made a flag of the world here in 1963. As a child, I used to come here to the Dominican monastery in Dubrovnik, which is from the 13th century. Here I saw first master paintings like Titian, Veronese, Bassano, and most of all there was a Dubrovnik master from mid-15th century, Nicholas Serota, who was a pupil of Carlo Crivelli, whose paintings mean a lot to me. I used to come to meditate here in these cloisters, and I used to think about this coded language in the medieval triptychs, and probably to make my own, some decisions were made here.
In the mid-70s, Dimitrijevic decided to use museum collections to create his art. When I realized that the interventions in the street had become popular among other artists, I decided to move to the most elitist studio I could have, the museum. It was a gold mine for my type of activity, which is a combination of sculpting, archaeology, and anthropology. In 1976, after 6 months of negotiations with the Berlin National Gallery, he was allowed to make a series of installations using master paintings from the museum collection. The very first installation, including a Kandinsky painting balanced against a piece of wood with an apple underneath, represents the precarious balance between high art, an everyday object, and nature.
Although I've been following his work for all these years, one of the moments I really remember well and still think of it as something very exceptional was when he was doing the first installations with original paintings at the National Gallery in Berlin. And it was for the first time ever he was given permission to make installations which would include the masterworks from the museum. And being in that gallery surrounded with paintings of Picasso and Matisse and Monet, Kandinsky and so on, and seeing all these fruits and whatever objects he brought there made a very surrealistic or very unreal feeling of the museum. And I knew something very exceptional was going on, maybe to use the word revolutionary, it's too strong, but somehow that feeling of unreal, of magic, of somehow remained in my mind as a first memory of first triptychs I ever seen.
Braco Dimitrijević's idea to use original masterworks from the museum collection was without precedent. After his pioneering appropriation of museum treasures, Dimitrijević's chances of creating another triptych increased considerably. For his exhibitions at the Van Abbe Museum Eindhoven, the Badische Kunstverein Karlsruhe, and the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, all held in 1979, the artist exhibited numerous installations, including original paintings by Picasso, Mondrian, Chagall, and Malevich, amongst others.
Un jour, on avait décidé avec Brazzo de faire un certain nombre.
One day, Brazzo and I decided to make a number of triptychus post-historicus with paintings from the collection of the National Museum of Modern Art.
Donc, on s'est installé dans le musée.
In the museum, we started installing a triptych to be photographed. We made one work which Brazzo entitled "There is Always Courage Behind a Work of Art," in which a Matisse painting was balanced against a shovel, leaning on the upper part of the shovel's handle. I was so afraid that the Matisse would fall that I was hidden behind the painting holding it. Of course, I was completely invisible in the photograph of the triptych. In the Triptychus Post-Historicus, the disparate and incongruous enter into new relationships. In these still lifes, the painting represents high art, the object, everyday life, and the fruit, nature. Once placed on the same platform, a complex symbolic interplay develops between them. The artist shakes up the accepted hierarchy in which art or culture would be at the top and nature at the bottom. In one Triptychus Post-Historicus, a painting by Moholy Nagy was placed next to a bicycle belonging to Joop Sanders, whose name is stated in the title of the triptych. In this way, Joop Sanders directly entered post-history, as have numerous other passers-by.
Le Triptychus Post-Historicus a une valeur de dépaysement tout à fait étonnante. On a toujours tendance à considérer les œuvres d'art comme des objets autonomes qui ont leur vie propre et leur
The Triptychus Post-Historicus makes things strange. We always tend to consider artworks as autonomous objects that have their own lives, their own aura. They're rare and they're very valuable. More than anyone else, curators are aware of their value. We set them apart from the usual hierarchy of objects. Braco Dimitrijevic shows up this fact in his post-historical triptych. He puts a painting next to an everyday object and a product of nature. And all of a sudden, a work of art becomes very poetic, and it acquires an almost exotic quality.
Et tout d'un coup, les œuvres d'art ont une espèce de valeur poétique et je dirais presque exotique. Et c'est cet exotisme de la pensée qui m'intéresse beaucoup. Les triptychus post-historici sont aussi des natures mortes. Et ce sont des natures mortes en 3 dimensions. Mais contrairement aux
The Triptychus Post-Historicus are 3-dimensional still lifes. But differently from still lifes we know in old painting, I think that these revive artworks. They enable us to see artworks in another light because of the objects put beside them.
All the works that he makes are physically very, very enticing works. They engage the visitor in a remarkable way. I mean, he's, in himself, he's you feel his presence, and that's true also of the work. I mean, his work is profoundly conceptual, but it also has this very, very strong physical presence. And I think that's one of the things that makes the work particularly engaging to an audience. So when, for instance, he made this project at the Tate, it immediately came on the front page of the Times newspaper because somehow he manages to create an image, which is a very, very powerful image, but nevertheless has a very strong theoretical underpinning.
I remember that there was a case during exhibition at the Tate Gallery that somebody, after visiting for the 3rd time my exhibition, realized that the works are not the copies. It is the originals. This gentleman wrote a letter to the Times objecting to the use of the original masterworks for the collection. This is a perfect example of misunderstanding between the spectator and the work of art, because for him this is a just valuable object. For me as well, it is extremely valuable object, but it is also something that transcends spiritual and philosophical values, which is very often neglected by the pressure of these declared values of an art object.
Since 1975, Dimitrijevic has created over 500 triptych installations using such masterpieces as Leonardo's Madonna through to Malevich's Red Square, sourced from the most prestigious museums around the world. Amongst a series of triptychs realized at the Guggenheim Museum in New York in 1988, the one with Chagall's masterpiece Green Violinist demonstrates Dimitrijevich's idiomatic way of forming unusual equations. The real instrument echoes the painted violin, but it's the color of the squash which corresponds to the color in Chagall's painting.
One thing that I really appreciated when you saw these first installations with Kandinsky and Picasso and so on, that you said, okay, one day if you have a good idea to incorporate my sculpture, come and talk to me. And this is a really very important issue, because I've been asked so many times by the people who are extremely knowledgeable, who are the connoisseurs, who are running the institutions, what would be Picasso's reaction, Matisse's reaction, Malevich's reaction to seeing their painting, their masterwork incorporated into contemporary artist installation. And that your instant reaction, it goes way back to mid-70s when we met in Bochum, when you met Clara and so on. So I think that answers all these possibly conservative reactions.
Well, because I think artists recognize that they're in the same game together and that their life is an alternative kind of existence, and they share the same competitiveness with the history of art, but with each other. And they also understand that probably the big contradiction they face is the market. So as soon as two artists collaborate that does something that puts the finger in the eye of the market, or kind of evaporates the pretense of the aura of the sacred work, then it makes everyone nervous. And I think those things have a useful purpose. And every frame, I think I said it before, has its ideological overtone. And those are the overtones I think you have to keep testing to redefine.
So,
take care.
Take care.
You too.
An interesting phenomenon related to Triptychus post-historicus is that since the late 70s, the paintings would often travel from one country to another to form a part of Dimitrijevich's installation. The artist says, in the Triptychus, there is no first, second, or third. Everything is at the same time, first, second, and third. On the same platform, which acts as a magical stage, each one of these three parts reveals its hidden identity. The painting, its physical properties, back of a canvas, the labels from the museums it has traveled through. In the triptych, something of a painting's aura reflects on the object. Instead of looking at them with the usual indifference, we start reflecting on their meanings, on the fates of their producers and one-time owners. Fruit is no longer just food, but becomes a metaphor for the eternal cycle of nature, birth, reproduction, and death. Since the 80s, the triptych installations acquired a more environmental quality. Dimitrijevic participated for the third time in Documenta in 1992, with two installations incorporating Géricault and Magritte paintings. The installation at the Museum Moderne Kunst in Vienna included 12 Renaissance portraits showing male members of the Venetian Tarsier family. 12 Yamaha motorbikes were first-rate modern symbols of male power, both social and sexual. The installation demonstrated the artist's idea that history is nothing but a mutilated image of the past, because the female part of the Tarsier family is omitted from this gallery of portraits. In 1996, with an opportunity of working at the Louvre, Dimitrijevic literally realized the first part of his motto: Louvre is my studio, street is my museum. Braco Dimitrijević's statement emphasizes the equal importance he attributes to these two places of work. In both, he breaks the conventional rules. According to the artist, the time of history is the time of division and classifications of knowledge, of creating specialized institutions, one of which is the museum. The Louvre, the archetype of the museum, is a mirror of historical man. It reflects his need to classify material vestiges according to chronological order. Post-history seeks to unite the fragments into a new harmonic world. Our world is made neither of paintings, nor bicycles, nor apples, but of all these things together.
So Post-Historic Times is a newspaper for subjective information. It comes out whenever information of subjective nature accumulates, and Post-Historic Times never lies. Therefore, please read Post-Historic Times. Bon, quand on a passé ce matin devant le verre de Mona Lisa,
this morning, when we walked past the Mona Lisa with its thick protection glass, that made me think what purpose that glass serves. And that reminded me of acts of aggression against certain paintings. Real revolution doesn't happen when people express their anger by throwing tomatoes at paintings, but when a fruit is gently placed next to a painting.
Mais quand on pose gentiment un fruit juste à côté un tableau.
The press has had the tendency to call me a conceptual artist. Of course, I'm proud of the movement that we created. My generation was the first to have the courage to insist that all art is conceptual. Today, I would say that I belong to another movement, to cosmic realism. Paintings were in museums, boats in harbors, fruits in the fields or marketplaces. I proposed an unfragmented vision, a synthetic view of the world, with the idea that an apple is to me what red was to Titian. I invite you to view this exhibition. I'll see you in 23 minutes. 23 years, or 23 million years, which comes to the same thing in a post-historical dimension. For his exhibition at the Musée d'Orsay in 2005, Dimitrijevic chose to work with two Van Gogh self-portraits. A market cart was a direct reference to the astronomical prices paid today for this artist, who died poor and neglected, while lemons referred to Van Gogh's tragic and sour life. Lemons and oranges fixed to the wall suggested the shape of a comet.
Pour moi, je dirais que dans l'histoire de l'art du XXe siècle, ça s'inscrirait dans une tradition, disons.
We could include this practice in the tradition of collage, assemblage. But what makes it completely different is that it's not done with a reproduction, but with an original artwork. Even if we're not completely aware of it, it changes our perception of the painting used in the installation.
Même si on n'est pas forcément censé le savoir, malgré tout, ça change complètement, je dirais, le regard qu'on porte sur le tableau.
Looking at the artist's watercolors of the past 3 decades, it's clear why the invitation to do a solo exhibition at the State Russian Museum in St. Petersburg was the fulfillment of the artist's old dream. Having access to the world's richest collection of Russian constructivism was an opportunity to exhibit numerous installations with paintings by artists such as Malevich, Rodchenko, Goncharova, and Tatlin. In the triptych with Malevich's Little Boy, axes were transformed into a metaphor for Russian political history. But they also evoked the history of sculptural forms. Axes striking, cutting into pedestals, were a reminder of danger. By uniting the paintings with working tools, Dimitrijevic carried on the Russian avant-garde's utopian dream of taking art out of salons and museums and bringing it closer to life as an existential necessity for all men. In the early 90s, Dimitrijevic started a new cycle with portraits. This time, not of anonymous people, but of well-known artists and scientists. As in the rest of his oeuvre, there is a paradox. The faces of the illustrious men are much less well-known than their achievements. That makes their portraits nearly as anonymous as those of passers-by. That connects Dimitrievic's portraits of passers-by to portraits of celebrities, whose faces are unknown. The men who are today commonly recognized as geniuses were ignored during their lifetime. This leads to Dimitrievic's critique of the social refusal of new ideas. Why were Kafka, Malevich, or Tesla isolated, unknown during their lifetimes, then discovered and glorified years after their deaths? Remembrance candles burned in front of their portraits in memory of all the geniuses rejected because of the inertia of the human spirit. Why did certain ideas have to wait centuries to pass through the filters of acceptability? The inventor of alternating current, Nikola Tesla, who according to the New York Times has invented the 20th century, is still almost completely unknown at the beginning of the 21st. In a series of works in Latin American countries, from Costa Rica to Brazil and Cuba, the artist would always relate to the details of the country's national history and would use the local natural products in his installations. At the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Jose, he created a piece with portraits of South American revolutionaries and statesmen and 1 ton of coffee beans. For the Zweitwenden, the Millennium exhibition at the Kunstmuseum in Bonn, the portraits of the artists, composers and thinkers whose ideas heralded the art and science of the 20th century were placed into a mountain of 7,000 coconuts. On the occasion of the Havana Biennale, Dimitrijevic created a work about individual and social utopias called Last Road to Paradise, which contained portraits of Proust, Kafka and Dostoevsky, and 2 tons of sugarcane. Nineteenth-century Viennese composers of popular operettas are violently struck by pickaxes. The artist claims that fostering kitsch leads directly to violence and political disaster. The work, Thin Edge of History, consists of portraits of the Russian artists Rodchenko, Tatlin, Larionov and Popova. These works are a reflection on the relationship between the political and artistic avant-garde at the time of the October Revolution. Their passionate reunion at the beginning and their dramatic split at the end. The exhibition at the Xindong Cheng Space for Contemporary Art in Beijing in 2006 was dedicated to early 20th century Chinese writers. In the gallery in Danshanzi District 798, the artist made a series of installations referring to the position of intellectuals in Chinese society.
My friend Braco Dimitrijevic is one of the most important...
Braco Dimitrijevic is one of the most important international artists and was one of the founders of conceptual art in the late 60s. Today, we are opening his first exhibition in China. In his work, keeping a Duchampian mentality, Dimitrijevic adopts a more complex position, introducing into art elements of nature. Duchamp called the procedure of taking an object found by chance objet trouvé, whilst Dimitrijevic called the found subject sujet trouvé. By giving the importance to an unknown person, he contributes to the democratization of art. This act inverts the rhetoric of the idea of monumental. This is profoundly conceptual work, which also has a political power. And whilst it is a conceptual work, it is not so in a neutral, statistical and impersonal manner, as were the works of American artists of his generation, but in a manner which is fully conscious of its socio-historical context.
Impersonale, come è stato fatto per esempio dagli artisti americani della sua generazione.
In the Confucius Temple complex in Beijing, the second most visited historic monument of the city, Dimitrijevic erected a monument made out of hundreds of bicycles and gigantic portraits of prominent Chinese writers. The installation, entitled Between Collective and Individual, readdresses central concerns of his work: history, the position of the individual in society, the ways myths and values are forged for posterity. In September 1981, in the article Peacocks in Cork Street, The Times announced an event at the Waddington Gallery in London. The event was the opening of Dimitrijević's one-man show at the gallery, for which a tableau vivant was set up. Surrounded by Picasso, Monet and Matisse paintings, a pair of living peacocks paraded amongst gilded stones. This work was the first of Dimitrijević's tableaux to confront living animals with signs of culture. Claude Lévi-Strauss saw this work, and the upshot was a meeting between the artist and the father of structural anthropology. At the end of the 1970s, the term culturescape was coined by Dimitrijevic to denote art which seeks its inspiration in the field of existing art and culture, establishes new structures out of previously known elements, explores the meanings and relationships of different cultural data. In 1983, the artist made a series of installations with wild animals. Pairs of lions seem to be jealously guarding the artist as child represented in two portraits. In this surreal archetypal family scene, the animal cage appeared as a primeval dwelling, the cave. The title, Memories of Childhood, may be less related to the artist's past than to the childhood of mankind, the time of prehistory, another recurrent theme in his work. In 1993, Dimitrijevic made an exhibition in the prehistoric cave of Lascaux. The artist sees Lascaux as an expression of undivided creativity, as opposed to today's division and classification of knowledge.
Mais dans le jardin des plantes comme ça, moi j'ai beaucoup aimé cette exposition parce que d'abord c'est un lieu.
I liked that exhibition a lot. It was a marvelous place. It really evoked a voyage in distant countries. It felt like a journey before a journey. One feels these distant places, the idea of the distant. In 1998, Braco Dimitrijevic undertook an adventurous enterprise. He made a one-man exhibition in the Paris Zoo. In this, the oldest zoo in the world, the artist presented 20 installations in the cages of jaguars, panthers, lions, crocodiles and gorillas, bringing wild animals face to face with works of art. The exhibition lasted 5 months, and it attracted 1 million visitors. It was reviewed by the international press of some 40 countries, and it received repeated CNN television coverage. A Gabo-esque head in the black leopard cage evoked the origin of Cubist sculpture in African art. These works juxtaposed culture with nature and confronted two cultural models, the Western, or Eurocentric, with the model of other cultures which live in much greater harmony with nature. In the lion's cage, the artist made a reconstruction of degenerate art show, in order to prove that wild animals could sometimes be more tolerant to art than some humans. The artist claims, "I made the work with the animals in order to learn about men."
C'est toujours le problème avec les nazis, quoi.
In the gorilla's cage, there were exhibited portraits of 3 official Nazi artists: Albert Speer, Leni von Riefenstahl, and Arno Breker. Gorilla, the animal with a pronounced sense of community, was opposed to the intellectuals, who, during the Third Reich, demonstrated an immense and devastating lack of moral and social responsibility. The elegance of the animals was enhanced by the presence of artworks associated with notions of beauty and spirituality. Every day, visitors witness the strange ballet of the pink flamingos in the midst of busts of Erik Satie and bronze cast cellos. The movements of these delicate creatures seemed choreographed to accompany Satie's musical harmony. In his statement, "If one looks down at the Earth from the moon, there is virtually no distance between the Louvre and the zoo," the artist proposes a cosmic perspective, a view from the moon. If we can get far enough away from scientific classifications, we may discover an unknown dimension of reality. German curator said, Braco Dimitrijevic is not only the son of a painter, but also a son of painting. An American critic said, Dimitrijevic is a creator of monuments to chance, an anthropologist of today's West, an archaeologist of the future, and the inventor of post-history. And what would the artist himself say? I did practically nothing. I just brought some things closer together. I am not a maker of objects, but a creator of vision.